welcome to the deep dive. You know the drill you sent us, the fascinating bits and pieces you've uncovered, the questions that keep you up at night, and we jump in to explore what's really going on. Today we're heading into some seriously compelling territory, sparked by declassified CIA documents about something called Project Sundak, alongside a pretty wild YouTube video, a remote viewing session connected to it.
Yeah, that video is something else.
We're talking about digging into classified intel and some very, well, out there investigative methods, so get ready.
What's really gripping here is where, documented intelligence efforts bump up against these more, let's just say, non-conventional ways of trying to understand things we don't fully grasp.
That's right.
The materials you shared really put that tension front and center, raising some fundamental questions about, well, how we perceive reality and how we gather information about it.
Totally. And you, our listener, sent in some absolutely fantastic stuff that really boils down to a couple of key areas we're going to try and unpack today.
Yeah, the questions were great.
You were particularly interested in knowing what was the main focus of Project Sundak, and what did the remote viewer in that YouTube session pick up about the project's goals and what they might have found.
It's a real rabbit hole of possibilities, so let's jump straight in.
Okay.
Our first point of entry is the remote viewer's initial sense of what they described as a technological energetic construct. Okay, let's unpack that term. What did they actually perceive?
Well, the remote viewer initially described this as a network of interconnected pillars made of energy.
Energy pillars.
Yeah, and all carrying an electrical charge. What's interesting right off the bat is how adaptable they perceived this structure to be. It wasn't a static thing, It could be enormous, apparently, but it could also shrink down to something as small as a microscopic implant.
So this technological energetic construct, it could be massive or incredibly tiny, almost like some kind of implant. That's quite a range.
It is a huge range.
And according to the remote viewer, what was it connected to? Anything specific? They specifically mentioned a connection only to what they called the mental body and the physical brain.
Only those two.
Seems so. And this distinction is going to be important, I think, as we delve deeper into their other perceptions.
Okay, so just to be clear for our listener, when we say mental body, are we talking about something distinct from the physical brain? Perhaps the realm of thoughts, consciousness, or something more subtle?
That's a good way to put it, yeah. In this context, it seems to refer to the non-physical aspects of our mental experience, separate from the biological hardware of the brain itself.
Right, that makes sense. Now, here's where things take a real turn. One of the CIA documents, this one from a related project called Project Sundak.
Sundak, yeah.
It mentioned the discovery of the Ark of the Covenant.
The big word.
When the remote viewer in the video was given this piece of information, what impressions did it trigger for them? Did anything change?
Oh, yeah. This seemed to unlock a whole new layer of perception for them. The remote viewer described a sense of influence coming from metaphysics. Think of that as the realm beyond the purely physical.
Okay.
Perhaps dealing with fundamental principles of reality or consciousness. They also saw a vision, this is wild, of documents flying around.
Dying doc.
Yeah. And a person who appeared to be directed by this metaphysica while they were writing.
Directed by metaphysics.
That was the perception. The overall sense was that there was some kind of non-physical or esoteric influence at play here.
Flying documents and someone being guided by something beyond the physical while writing. It sounds like the mere mention of the Ark opened up a very different kind of awareness for the remote viewer.
It certainly seemed to.
Now, the documents also mentioned that another remote viewer, known only as Agent 032,
at 032,
had located an artifact that sounded similar to the Ark.
Yeah.
What did Agent 032 perceive about this location?
Agent 032 used the term vortex, but interestingly, not in a purely geographical sense.
Not like a spot on a map.
No. They perceived it as a metaphysically place, a location that had a distinct energetic quality, almost like an energetic shift in the environment.
Okay.
Which they described as a loop. So it wasn't just about coordinates. It was about a place imbued with a particular kind of energy that seemed to cycle or repeat somehow.
A metaphysically vortex, a loop of energy. That's definitely not the kind of thing you'd expect to find with a metal detector.
Not at all.
And there was more to Agent 032's perception of this vortex, wasn't there? Something about seeing the same person in multiple places at the same time.
Yes, exactly. This is what they called implication. The remote viewer perceived the same individual appearing simultaneously in different locations within this vortex.
Whoa.
Yeah, this led to the interpretation of a game being played out, influenced by these metaphysigenous forces, almost like a manipulation of reality within that specific energetic space.
A game influenced by metaphysics where someone can be in multiple places at once. It really challenges our everyday understanding of space and time, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Pushes the boundaries.
Now, Agent 032 also claimed that this artifact, this ark-like object, contained the chest of the tablets of the law.
The commandments.
Right. What did the remote viewer in our video pick up about these laws? Was it straightforward?
Not really. The remote viewer's perceptions seemed to shift the idea of law away from simple commandments and towards something more like ritual.
Ritual, how so?
They didn't just see rules written on stone, but a hidden protocol embedded within the words themselves, possibly even physically or energetically incorporated into the tablets.
A hidden protocol, almost like a piece of code embedded within the language, and maybe even physically part of the tablets. That's a very different take on the Ten Commandments.
It's very different, much more complex.
And the remote viewer also mentioned something about the number 12 in relation to these laws, didn't they?
They did. They perceived the number 12 as being intentionally chosen, with each of these laws having a specific function or role in different locations across the Earth. This suggests a deliberate and geographically distributed significance to these protocols.
Like a system.
Yeah, almost like a system with different components located in specific places.
12 laws, each with a specific role in different parts of the world. It's painting a picture of something far more intricate than just a religious artifact.
Much more.
Moving on, the CIA report mentioned guardian entities protecting the Ark with unknown forces. Who did the remote viewer perceive as these guardians?
Okay, so initially, the remote viewer perceived reptilian-like beings.
Reptilians, okay. That theme again.
Right. However, this was quickly followed by a more prominent sense of beings they identified as Dracos.
Dracos, okay.
And they connected these entities back to the earlier idea of metaphysician dictation or control.
The writing person.
Exactly, suggesting that these guardians were involved in the process of actually incorporating those protocols onto the tablets.
So reptilians and Dracos connected to this non-physical control and the actual encoding of these protocols onto the tablets. It's a narrative that definitely veers into some less conventional ideas.
To say the least.
The report also stated that the Ark could only be opened by authorized individuals at the right moment. Did the remote viewer's perceptions align with this?
Partially. Their perception had some overlap, but with a significant twist.
No.
While they did perceive a connection to what's often referred to as the third eye,
Okay.
they didn't see it as a source of inherent permission, like you have the key. Instead, they perceived information being directed, or even pumped was the word, from this metaphysica into the individual's mental space.
Pumped in.
Yeah,
Not unlocked from within.
that was the sense. And as for the idea of authorization, they felt it was more complex, possibly linked back to those initial energetic pillar structures they perceived.
The construct from the beginning.
Yeah, perhaps acting as some kind of key or access point itself.
So connection to the third eye, but more as a receiver of information than a source of inner authority. And those initial energetic pillars might be crucial for actually accessing the Ark. Interesting. What about this right moment? What did that signify to the remote viewer?
The right moment was envisioned first as a key physically opening a door. Simple enough.
Right.
But it also resonated with the image of a clock with a ticking sound, which they interpreted as a kind of natural timing or cycle, not a man-made clock.
A natural clock.
Yeah. This was connected to a perceived alignment of different frequencies, the physical frequencies of the Earth, Terra, the collective consciousness of humanity,
Right.
and an external influence that was primarily metaphysiogeny in nature, all syncing up.
An alignment of these different frequencies, Earth, our collective consciousness, and this metaphysiogeny influence all coming together at a specific time, like a natural clock reaching a certain point. That's a really evocative image.
It is, isn't it?
And it seems the remote viewer also considered the possibility of this right moment not being fixed to our current timeline.
Yes, that came up too. They had a sense that this opportune moment might exist on an alternate temporal line,
Another timeline.
which connects back to their earlier perceptions of similar scenarios playing out with slight variations, almost as if on parallel timelines or in different versions of reality.
Different timelines and different realities.
Yeah.
It certainly adds a layer of complexity to the idea of a specific right moment for opening the Ark.
Definitely complicates things.
Now, Agent 032 also claimed that anyone trying to open the Ark without this authorization would be destroyed by its protectors using some kind of unknown power. What did the remote viewer make of this claim? Was it just pure power?
Well, the remote viewer used the word magic in this context, but, and this is key, they framed it through the lens of the placebo effect.
Placebo, like belief.
Exactly, the powerful way in which our beliefs can shape our reality. Their perception was that the danger isn't inherent to the Ark itself or some external force wielded by its protectors, but rather tied to the individual's own belief in potential negative consequences, which could then manifest as a form of self-destruction.
So, the danger isn't in some external power guarding the Ark, but in the mind of the person trying to force it open, the power of their own belief turning against them. That's a fascinating psychological angle.
It really is. Puts the power back on the individual in a strange way.
Now, let's shift gears slightly. The remote viewer's initial perception of the Ark was as both this grand technology and also as a tiny implant-like device connected to the mental body and brain. Let's go back to that implant. Where did they perceive it being located, and who did they sense created it?
Okay, the implant. They perceived this as a cylindrical structure made up of those same energetic pillars we discussed earlier.
Right, the pillars again.
And it was located precisely in the center of the brain. It also had a rotational movement, like the hand of a clock.
Rotating in the brain, okay.
The information they received suggested it functions as a kind of biological program, which could limit conscious will.
Limit will.
How? Drawing an analogy to how the amount of daylight limits our activities, or even to the way different personalities might become dominant at different times in someone with multiple personalities, like switching programs.
Wow. Okay, and the creators?
The term that came to mind for the viewer was hierarchies.
Just hierarchies? As the entities responsible for creating this brain implant. And were there any specific groups of people or locations associated with it?
Yes, the remote viewer linked this implant to populations connected to ancient stone circle structures.
Like Stonehenge?
Potentially, yeah. Found in various parts of the world, Asia, Northern Europe, and Southern Africa were specifically mentioned.
Okay.
However, it's important to note that they perceived this implant as not being universal. It was seen as rarer.
Not everyone has one.
No, definitely not. Associated with individuals who are highly creative, perhaps even to the point of being on the edge of psychosis, and who tend to have an inflated ego, which apparently makes them more susceptible to the influence of these hierarchies.
Rarer, linked to creative but potentially unbalanced individuals with big egos, and connected to these ancient stone circles across the globe. It's a very specific and somewhat unusual set of connections.
Very specific, yeah.
Now let's talk about the physical Ark, the one that's traditionally described as dating back to around 1445 BC, made of acacia wood covered in gold, inscriptions containing the Ten Commandments. Did the remote viewer confirm its physical existence in their perception?
Yes, they had a clear and affirmative perception of the Ark's physical existence, so a real object.
Okay, so in their view, a physical Ark does exist. Now, earlier, the remote viewer had that vision of a person writing under this Metaphysics influence.
Right, the flying documents guy.
Who did they perceive this writer to be, and what were they actually writing?
Okay, so they perceived the writer as being in a kind of trance state, not in full control of their own thoughts or actions.
Not in control.
No. They specifically saw a reptilian-like entity influencing the writer's hands.
Influencing the hands.
Making it appear as if the reptilian was the one physically doing the writing, like puppeteering.
Wow.
The writing itself wasn't perceived as standard words, but rather as signs, a combination of hieroglyphs and drawings, which they noted was consistent with the form of the Hebrew language at that point in history.
A reptilian entity guiding the hand to write in these ancient Hebrew symbols. It's a very striking image.
It is very vivid.
And the big question, did the remote viewer perceive this person to be Moses?
They hesitated on this one. They offered a yes, but then immediately clarified that their perception didn't fully align with the conventional understanding of Moses.
How so? Not Moses.
They saw him more as a constructed figure, an invention almost, where only his name and his role as a leader of the Hebrews held true. The rest felt different.
A constructed figure with only the name and leadership role being accurate. That's a significant departure from the traditional narrative.
Huge departure.
And what about the transmission of the Ten Commandments, which is traditionally attributed to God? Who did the remote viewer perceive that entity to be?
The name that came through for this entity was Atar, or something phonetically similar, A-H-T-A-R maybe.
Atar.
And interestingly, the remote viewer also had a perception of Moses looking into a mirror and seeing this Atar reflected within himself.
Seeing Atar in the mirror.
Yeah, suggesting the possibility of multiple personalities existing within one individual, or perhaps even a form of possession.
Atar as the entity giving the commandments, and Moses seeing Atar within himself, hinting at a fragmented identity or even possession. This deep dive is certainly taking us to some unexpected places.
Definitely off the beaten path.
Let's delve a bit further into the creation of the Ark itself. Did the remote viewer perceive an energetic or esoteric origin for it? Where did it come from?
Well, their perception was that the Ark didn't originate from a single specific entity like Atar or the hierarchies,
No.
but rather arose from the collective consciousness of Earth itself.
The collective consciousness created it.
That was the sense. As if a new impulse for control or influence manifested within the collective human psyche and then solidified into this physical and energetic object. Almost like a new pillar being added to the underlying structure of reality, the matrix, if you will.
Not a divine creation, but something that emerged from the collective consciousness as a tool for control. That's a really thought-provoking perspective.
Changes the whole dynamic, doesn't it?
It really does. Now, going back to those brain implants for a second, what percentage of the Jewish population did the remote viewer perceive as having one? Was it widespread within that group?
They perceived a relatively small percentage, actually, around 15%.
Only 15%. That's lower than I think many might have assumed if it was specifically tied to one particular group, especially given the Moses connection.
Yeah, it suggests it's not tied exclusively or broadly, maybe more to specific lineages or roles within that group, or perhaps related to that creativity ego factor we discussed.
Makes sense. Let's circle back to the number 12. The remote viewer noted its intentional use in connection with the laws. Why 12? Was there inherent power in the number?
Not inherently, no. They perceive 12 as a number that was deliberately chosen because it aligns with various natural cycles and symbols, constellations, stars, planets, the phases of the moon, things people already observe. The sense was that an artificial synchronicity was created around this number to imbue it with later significance and credibility.
Give it weight.
Exactly. Almost like setting a standard or a foundational element that would seem natural and powerful later on. This also ties back to the idea of the 12 laws having specific roles at different energetic points on Earth.
The geographical connection again.
Yeah, which they visualized as pyramids or similar structures that concentrate energy, like energetic magnets.
So 12 wasn't inherently special, but it was strategically linked to existing natural patterns and energetic locations to give it a manufactured significance.
War.
Sort of piggybacking on existing natural resonance. Now, we touched on the esoteric reason behind the Ten Commandments, these seemingly beneficial universal laws that were, according to the remote viewer, primarily dictated by reptilian and Draco entities.
Sure.
What was the perceived underlying motive for transmitting these laws? Why give humanity rules?
Yeah, why give good rules if you're, maybe not so good? The remote viewer perceived it as a kind of dirty game, was the phrase used, being played with the collective consciousness.
A dirty game.
The idea was to present an image of perfection and obedience, an ideal that humanity would strive for.
Right, the commandments seem pretty absolute.
And then to subtly create conditions, maybe internally or externally, that would make achieving that ideal practically impossible, ultimately leading to widespread imbalance, guilt, judgment, conflict.
A deliberate setup for failure, creating inner and outer conflict through the unattainable ideal of the Ten Commandments. It's a rather cynical, but I have to say undeniably compelling interpretation.
It's a dark view, but it fits the narrative they were perceiving.
Let's revisit the question of who is authorized to open the Ark. The remote viewer initially had a partially aligned perception with the CIA report, the third eye connection. What were their stronger feelings on this after further exploration? Did they stick with the authorized person idea?
No, actually. Their stronger sense, later on, was that the information about authorized individuals was fundamentally false.
False. The whole thing.
Yeah, that no such truly authorized person actually exists. When they were asked to connect with the entity that transmitted this idea of authorization perceived as a subtle, formless energy belonging to one of these hierarchs,
Okay.
the intention that came through was to instill a sense of worthlessness in humans, to tap into and amplify feelings of self-doubt and a lack of inherent value. Like, you're not worthy, only the special chosen one is.
So the whole concept of authorized access is a manipulation designed to make us feel inadequate and powerless.
Huh.
That's a rather unsettling thought.
Deeply unsettling, a psychological control mechanism.
And what about the magic associated with forced opening? We established that it seems to be rooted in placebo-based belief. Where did the remote viewer perceive the physical arc, or perhaps multiple arcs, to be located? Did they get a location?
Interestingly, yes, and it wasn't just one. They perceived two distinct exemplars, or instances, of the arcs.
The arcs.
Two. One was located underground, beneath a large European building in an environment devoid of air. Very hidden.
Under a building in Europe.
Okay.
And the other?
The other was situated in a more exposed, mountainous cave environment, possibly in the Arabia Saudita region. More like the traditional setting, perhaps. The subterranean arc, the European one, was perceived as having been created first.
Before the other one.
Yeah, for a civilization that was eventually wiped off the face of the earth.
Okay.
A precursor civilization.
Wow.
With the second one, the cave one, being created for our current civilization.
Okay, that's huge. And the tablets inside? Same laws.
Furthermore, they sense that the tablets within each arc contain slightly different sets of laws, reflecting the values and societal structures of their respective civilizations.
Tailored laws.
Although the core principles weren't drastically different, apparently, similar themes, maybe different emphasis.
Two arcs, one hidden beneath Europe for a lost civilization, and another in a cave, possibly in Saudi Arabia for us, each with a slightly different version of the laws. This is turning into quite the archaeological enigma.
Definitely raises more questions than answers, doesn't it?
It really does. Finally, we called for Agent 032 in the remote viewing session, the original CIA viewer. What did our remote viewer perceive about them?
Right, contacting 032. The initial perception was of a being that appeared somewhat human, but possessed insect-like antennae.
Antenna.
Yeah, they identified it as an insectoid, similar in form to a mantis.
A mantis-like being. So, Agent 032 wasn't human.
Well, here's the really strange part. Crucially, this agent wasn't perceived as being fully alive on Earth in a complete sense. They described it as being internally deceased, a kind of hollow shell.
A hollow shell. What does that even mean?
Their subliminal essence, the original consciousness, was located as a small fragment floating within a cage-like space, disconnected from the physical body,
Okay.
which remains on Earth but is now inhabited by this insectoid entity. The body's walking around, but someone else is driving.
So the original Agent 032 is trapped somewhere, and their body is piloted by an insectoid.
That was the perception, yes. Pretty disturbing.
Extremely. And when asked about what the agent or the entity in the agent felt upon connecting with the arc.
The perceived sensation was a powerful stimulation of the mental body, likened to an ecstatic or euphoric feeling similar to the effects of certain drugs.
A high.
A real high, yeah, followed by a significant mental crash, like a drug cycle.
And was the original Agent 032 actually using drugs for the CIA work?
The remote viewer clarified that Agent 032 was in a natural state, not under the influence of hallucinogenic substances while working for the CIA.
Okay.
But importantly, that the metaphysician information they extracted, the stuff about the vortex and implication, was not entirely accurate or reliable, maybe influenced by the entity or the experience itself.
A hollowed-out agent, inhabited by an insectoid, experiencing a drug-like high from connecting with the arc, and extracting information that wasn't entirely accurate. That's a truly bizarre and unsettling final piece to this incredibly complex puzzle.
It certainly is. This deep dive into Project Sundak and the associated remote viewing session has offered us a truly fascinating, if highly unconventional perspective on a very well-known legend. We've explored a blend of technological and energetic constructs, apparent metaphysician influences, and entities that seem to operate entirely outside the realm of our normal everyday perception.
Absolutely. From the idea of a technological arc and these brain implants to, reptilian dictation and the potential manipulation of our collective consciousness, not to mention two arcs. The information we've explored today presents a stark contrast to more traditional historical and religious interpretations. A very stark contrast. So for you, our listener, consider this. How might we need to reevaluate historical narratives and our understanding of power structures if we entertained, even for a moment, the possibility of such unconventional forces at play?
What does it change?
And what does this tell us about the inherent limitations and perhaps even the untapped potential of different methods of gathering information about the unknown? Remote viewing, CIA docs. Where does the truth lie?
Or is it somewhere in between or somewhere else entirely?
Exactly. It's certainly a lot to process, but hopefully this deep dive has given you some truly provocative ideas to consider. Thanks for joining us.